Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. As you know, our topic is thresholds in cyberspace, and our speaker today is Dr. Jacqueline Schneider. This is the latest in a series of meetings we've conducted to try to think more deeply into the place of cyberspace in broader strategic conflict in the 21st century. One of the principal functions of the center is to try to understand the problem of modern strategic conflict and in all of its dimensions, to understand the ways in which our adversaries think about the problem that we present to them and our superior or at least substantial ability to escalate to defend our interests and those of our allies. Those adversaries have set out theories of victory, a term I've tried to help all of you to come to use. But theories of victory in the spirit of Clausewitz. Clausewitz defined victory in a particular way. He took a particular view of war, as you all know. War was a continuation of politics by other means. So victory wasn't defined as the moment when you vanquish your enemy on the battlefield. It's a political outcome. It's when that enemy chooses, makes a political decision to no longer run the costs and risks of continued conflict. And to try to bring us to that culminating point, our adversaries think about imposing new cost and new risk on us and our allies. In other words, they think about escalating a conflict. But this isn't a dial without numbers on it. There are particular threshold points as they conceive them in conflicts, where there's, in the language of the Russians, the prescribed dosage of damage, enough to get the desired political effect, but not too much to get an undesired political effect. So my take on a lot of the work we've done on adversary thinking about modern strategic conflict is that they've done a lot of thinking about escalation and thresholds. And they've done that thinking both in domain and across domains. And in a word, we're playing catch up. We're trying to both understand their thinking and understand the nature of competition and escalation in each of these domains and across them. And cyberspace has looked like an entirely alien territory to people interested in these questions, in part because it is so distinct in many of its functions and attributes from the other domains of competition, and in part because it's so much wrapped in secrecy. So when Jackie indicated that she had this work underway, I thought this was a great opportunity to come and push our thinking forward as a community, and I'm very grateful to her for carving out the time to come and join us. This is an opportunity for her to return to the center. She's been a participant in past workshops of ours on cross-domain deterrence. And welcome back. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. She is a Hoover Fellow. This is an inaugural program at the Hoover Institution to bring in a next generation of scholars and give them an opportunity, a substantial opportunity for a number of years to work away in their field. As the Hoover Fellow on cybersecurity, she's doing this work as well as some related work, which she is mentioned in the biography. She remains a non-resident fellow at the Naval War College, where she spent the last few years, in its Institute for Cyber and Innovation Policy. And as those of you in the cyber business know, there's something called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission at work these days, a congressionally chartered commission, and she's played a role as senior advisor to the commission, and this work is drawn in part from that support role. Please join me in welcoming Jackie Schneider.
Thanks so much, Brad. And I really thank you all for taking your time today to sit and discuss the thresholds question. This is the first time I've presented this research, and so I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts and having a discussion about this research. Now, as Brad alluded to, this research comes from work I was doing for the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was trying to look at different parts of cyber strategy in order to see whether the cyber strategy that the US was enacting was really going to work. And it really competes different perspectives on the role of cyber in US overarching strategy against each other. So we came to the Solarium Commission with 2 new cyber strategies that were penned in 2018. And that was kind of the strategy that we were meant to look at, explore, decide whether we wanted to revise. So up here I have 2 excerpts from some of the strategies that have come out in the last few years. The first one on the top is the Cyber Command Strategic Vision, which came out in 2018. And in the vision, Cyber Command articulates a much more, they would call it active, I would call it probably offensive, cyber posture, in which Cyber Command persistently engages its enemies with close contact operations on a day-to-day basis. And so persistent engagement is kind of, it's like their just do it motto for their vision. And they articulated that persistent engagement will operate continuously below the threshold of armed conflict to weaken our institutions and gain strategic advantage. So their baseline assumption going into developing their vision was that US adversaries were constantly probing US vulnerabilities and attacking the United States, but doing it below what they considered a threshold of armed conflict. And because of that, Cyber Command therefore needed to change its posture away from deterrence and preparation for events and more toward actively countering these cyber operations. So the idea of a threshold is pivotal to the success of their strategy. We also saw the concept of threshold appear within the Defense Cyberspace Strategy, which came out shortly after the Cyber Command vision. And in it, the Defense Department introduced a new concept called Defend Forward. We can talk a little bit more about what Defend Forward is. My perception of it is that it's a series of counter cyber operations that actively degrade the adversary's ability to conduct cyber operations from their own networks. So, but contingent to Defend Forward being successful is the ability to conduct these operations without escalating to some sort of violent retaliation. So the strategy says that Defend Forward will disrupt or halt malicious cyber activity at its source, including activity that falls below the level of armed conflict. So the idea of thresholds is actually pivotal to the success of these strategies, because essentially what the US is saying here is that we are going to conduct cyber operations on a day-to-day basis. And in the past, administrations like the Obama administration chose to restrain those cyber operations for fear of escalation. And these strategies actually assert that you don't have to be worried about escalating because there is a cyber threshold that exists that bounds the competition in cyberspace, and therefore the US needs to participate in cyberspace. The difficulty for these strategies is that the strategies actually end up creating 2 thresholds. One threshold is this threshold at the bottom level of the escalation ladder, which is not really defined, and we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that threshold might be. And that threshold is going to scope our adversaries' retaliatory options so that the US can conduct counter cyber operations, but not worry about starting a conventional war. But at the same time, the US is trying to maintain a threshold up at the strategic level, which is the use of strategic cyber attacks against domestic critical infrastructure or nuclear command and control, things that could have immediate, large-scale strategic effects. So this is a real challenge for the United States because they've built a strategy that requires 2 thresholds that are somewhat dissonant. So part of what our goal in the commission was to figure out, can these 2 thresholds exist at the same time? If so, what are the types of operations, signaling mechanisms that the US needs to adopt in order to maintain this really difficult balancing mechanism of having 2 cyber thresholds? So in order to start this project, the first thing we really needed to do was understand what thresholds are. And for any of you who have studied nuclear weapons or nuclear stability, the thresholds concept really comes from the nuclear world. and it has been intimately tied to concepts of escalation. So what's interesting is thresholds are very rarely defined, but they often show up in other definitions. So there's a good piece, I think it's a RAND work by Morgan et al., in which they define escalation using the concepts of thresholds. So escalation is an increase in the intensity or scope of conflict that crosses thresholds considered significant by one or more of the participants. Conable defined thresholds as a negotiated, declared, or tacitly understood delimiter between measures short of war and high-order conflict, such as full-scale conventional or nuclear war. So the reality is that thresholds exist only in our minds. And what they primarily do is they serve as a means by which we can make conceptual understandings of the way in which escalation ladders progress. And we first see this really develop with Kahn. So this is Kahn's beautiful and highly linear, I think it's 44 rungs of the escalation ladder. And the way Kahn organized his thoughts about escalation was grouping these different rungs on the escalation ladder within groups that were separated by thresholds. And this is where we really see the idea of thresholds being introduced into US nuclear strategy and the discussion of strategy in general. So, we've had the don't rock the boat threshold, nuclear war is unthinkable, no nuclear use, and then nuclear use all the way up. So you see that for Kahn, it wasn't that these thresholds were like real things that existed that you could reach out and touch. They were more just ways in which he could organize what he believed were similar groupings of actions, and that the thresholds represented a significant change in the group of outcomes that would indicate a higher intensity of conflict. Most of Kahn's groupings and understandings of escalation thresholds were based on targets or effects. So what is the scope of the violence that's created? Has it increased its geographic scope? Are there more nations that are involved? Are there nuclear effects as opposed to conventional effects? So most of the way he thought about these different thresholds was in the effects that different types of operations could create. Are they against civilians? Are they against military members? But the idea of thresholds has really become internalized within US, especially nuclear policy. And we see this idea of there being kind of breaks in between different groups of actions show up in other discussions. Fire breaks are an extreme example of a threshold. So fire breaks started occurring, and there's a really great speech by I'm going to mispronounce the name, but Eindhoven in 1965, where he talks about the use of nuclear weapons becoming a fire break, in which it's not just a threshold that separates different groups of outcomes, but it is such a large threshold that it becomes something that actually stops any escalation above. The use of nuclear weapons becomes such a large decision with such enormous effects and enormous repercussions that it actually is a threshold that serves as a fire break. This is slightly different concept than red lines, which also kind of evoke the same sort of linear escalatory framework that we see in Kahn, but are actually the manifestation of creating costs for a choice. And so red lines are usually, hopefully, clearly articulated from policy members showing, at this point, I am willing to conduct retaliatory options that are more violent or that increase my move me up the escalatory ladder. So all these concepts are somewhat different and yet rely on each other. So what we were kind of most concerned with on the commission was trying to understand what actually created the thresholds. Because understanding what creates them can help us understand whether the thresholds that we think exist in cyberspace are things that we can actually rely on or not. So I'm going to talk about thresholds, thinking of them as being defined by two characteristics. The first characteristic is the strength of the threshold. So that's the difference between a fire break that's very strong and a threshold that's kind of easily overstepped. So if you were on a ladder, a physical manifestation of a ladder, you could think of something, this characteristic of the threshold as being kind of the width of the threshold. So if I'm climbing up the ladder and there is a separation, but that separation is relatively small, that's maybe a threshold that's not very strong. But maybe the rungs of the ladder are significantly spaced out. That would mean that the threshold is stronger. So that's one characteristic which helps us understand and define thresholds. The other is its actual placement on the escalatory ladder. So is it at the bottom? Is it at the top? Is it in the middle? And these two things may or may not be connected. So you might have a threshold that's near the top of the escalation ladder, but is actually a relatively weak threshold. So it would be, much skinnier. So that's how kind of we conceptualizing and thinking about what separates and what the difference is between different types of thresholds. So we started looking at how these thresholds were actually constructed. And the predominant way in which thresholds are constructed is by an adversary's perception of cost, both when they're thinking of their own threshold, their own perceptions of cost, and then when thinking about the adversary's escalation, what they perceive the adversary's perception of cost to be. And there's a few different ways that you can think about perception of cost. One is in the potential retaliatory cost. If I conduct this action, is there a high possibility that the adversary is going to conduct a violent retaliatory measure, or something that causes my civilians to die, or where they attack a military installation that decreases my power? So that's one potential cost to that threshold. The other is a domestic cost. So if I go over that threshold, let's say I decide I'm going to mobilize the reserves and put them into combat. Well, that might come at a high domestic cost because that requires a significant amount of constituent support. So that's a threshold that might exist because it's just more costly for you to conduct it domestically. And then finally, there's a normative cost. And so we see the discussion of normative costs really, when we talk about the nuclear taboo and the normative effects of nuclear use, but also with chemical and biological weapons, as well as attacks on civilians. And so you can see thresholds that exist also because there's a high normative cost where this is just morally repugnant to conduct this particular action. Thresholds are also the strength of thresholds are also partly because some are more or less agreed upon. And so there are thresholds in which a treaty has provided a definition of the threshold. And it's really useful to have a threshold that exists for a long time if everyone understands what exactly the threshold is. Or thresholds in which there are punitive consequences for stepping over it. So once again, treaty obligations, legal ramifications, economic ramifications that are put into some sort of verifiable measure so that both parties involved understand if I cross this threshold, there will be verifiable consequences. There are actually very few agreed upon thresholds, and the strength of those thresholds tends to wax and wane over time. And then finally, effects-based versus means thresholds. And I think this is a really interesting debate. If you look at Khan and you look at the way he built his escalation ladder, it's almost completely based on effects. But if you look at, but almost everything for him was like above nuclear. So the don't rock the boat threshold is the vast majority of what's happening now. And if you look at what's happening in Iran, you see that the US and Iran are playing a very delicate game of understanding where each rung of the escalation ladder exists underneath the Khanian don't rock the boat threshold, and how the means by which attacks are created, even the means by which attacks are creating the same effects, are imputing some sort of intentions from the players involved in the crisis. And so there are some means that impute a higher threshold. And this is something I think that we're seeing being built right now, and something that we're especially exploring for cyberspace. So in summary, when we're looking at characteristics that create strong thresholds, so wider thresholds, there are situations in which there are treaties with punishment mechanisms. There are agreed upon definitions of the threshold. There's a precedent of the threshold over time. The nuclear non-use is perhaps the best example of this. Costly declaratory statements. So if you're making a red line in addition to having a threshold. Domestic punishment mechanisms. First order effects versus cascading effects. We've looked at some of the work in psychology about how people conceptualize threat, found that weapons or options that create first-order destructive effects are much more likely for people to view as higher escalatory than those that create second or third order effects. And then overt actions versus covert actions. But there are kind of separate characteristics that move thresholds up and down the escalation ladder. And one is the significant or measurable physical effects and the amount of violence that's involved with the operation. Civilian targets versus military targets. The geographic scope, is this occurring over multiple countries? Is it increasing the distance of violence that's occurring? And now something that we're looking at more is means that are more or less high saliency, or those that have high order economic effects. So then looking at where thresholds have existed. The only threshold that consistently does not get violated is the use of nuclear weapons. There have been other thresholds that have existed for some period of time and then been over time eroded. Chemical weapons use is a really good example of that. A lot of the characteristics of a chemical weapons threshold would suggest that it's a very strong threshold, right? We made it through World War II without using chemical weapons. There are actual treaties. It's somewhat verifiable. But because of the use in the Middle East, we're seeing that that actually is being eroded. So thresholds are not fixed in time. They change in their strength according to how the actors utilize them. And then one of the means-based thresholds we're examining is the use of unmanned weapons versus manned weapons. In terms of effects, I think people generally agree that civilian targets are generally much more escalatory than military targets, as well as when a particular strike spreads violent effects to another country. And then something that you see a lot in the cyber realm is the use of kind of legal thresholds. So cyber operations under armed conflict, that's actually the predominant threshold that they use, which is a somewhat murky legal threshold. But there's also kind of been examples of thresholds that are set by various arms control treaties. So if what I am trying to do is not just look at how thresholds exist, but look how the US can create and uphold their own thresholds, then it's important to understand kind of where and how these thresholds exist theoretically. And to do that, I spent some time looking at the literature on norms and the spread of norms and how different norms are adopted, how they cascade, and then how they are internalized. And actually, the process of norm generation adoption is very similar to how thresholds are constructed and then maintained. So for those of you who are not IR theory geeks, which we should all be IR theory geeks, there's the definition of norms is a collective expectations for the proper behavior of actors within a given identity. So norms are kind of like customs, how we behave because we think that's how we're expected to behave. Sometimes norms are moral, but sometimes norms are just kind of customs by which keep us secure. For instance, norms about what side of the road we drive on. Those are things that just, it benefits everyone's security if we all agree to conduct those similarly. So it's interesting to explore how norms emerge because thresholds are basically norms of behavior. They're norms of behavior about the escalatory effects of our actions and the potential kind of cap to the actions that we take in crises. So there's really good work here by Martha Finnemore and Catherine Sickink on the norm life cycle. And they talk about the emergence of norms, which is quite often starts with the norm entrepreneur or different institutions in which they have an idea. And they are trying to circulate that belief or that idea among people that are active participants in the success of the norm. And the norm entrepreneur uses a series of incentives, positive incentives, and negative disincentives in order to convince people to follow that particular belief or custom of behavior. So a lot of the work on this looks at international organizations and the way in which international organizations punish people who don't follow through with norms, or rewards them with different kind of economic benefits, trade benefits. But I think when we think about thresholds, we can think about how you could create norm incentives and disincentives using a lot of the similar concepts that you would take from deterrence. Finding means to threaten punishment, for example, could be an effective way to create a norm cascade. And then finally, there's an internalization of a norm. And the nuclear taboo is probably the greatest example of the internalization of a norm that manifests itself into a very, very strong threshold. The norms that generally succeed are those that are highly specific, highly durable, and you see concordance within actors. Generally, this is because of a norm entrepreneur. And so part of what we are working on the commission is thinking about how the United States can think of itself not as a norm entrepreneur that negotiates solely at the UN, but how the actions that it takes domestically and internationally in cyberspace and beyond can actually serve as a norm entrepreneur in order to create and maintain the thresholds the US needs to strategically succeed. All right, so here, this is kind of a nice graphic explanation of what I've been talking about over the last few slides. So you can see in this kind of example, you have, multiple thresholds, but these thresholds are at different points in the escalation ladder, but they're also at different strengths. So threshold 2 might be like lower strength, whereas threshold 1 is higher. And then the scope of actions between the thresholds sometimes can help bound or support the threshold. So if we have significant amount of actions between like threshold 1 and threshold 2, that might give states more bargaining space. So each of these characteristics kind of work together to define and help us understand which thresholds are more or less likely to succeed. So moving into cyberspace, we need to understand whether the thresholds that the US government thinks exist actually exist. So what's the evidence? So when people started looking at cyberspace and escalation, they spent a lot of time debating whether cyberspace could create the same sort of effects as other more conventional or even nuclear means. And whether what mattered to escalation was the effects that cyberspace created or the means by which they were conducted. There's a really great piece by Henry Farrell and Charles Glazer in the Journal of Cybersecurity that lays this out and looks at the role that saliencies about the effects and about the means may play in the cyberspace escalation. A lot of debate in the first few years that this started, and most people really thought that cyberspace was going to be highly escalatory. That's because a lot of the characteristics of cyberspace, that it's highly uncertain, and that there's a problem with attribution, that there can be a lot of actors, and a lot of those, that it's very quick, those characteristics theoretically suggest that it should be a highly escalatory domain. But the reality is that we've seen almost no escalation from cyberspace. And there's an increasing amount of empirical work that suggests that there is very little escalatory pressure from cyberspace operations. So there's a series of large and data set analyses conducted by Brandon Valeriano and Ryan Manis, and then a later work by Valeriano, Jensen, and Manis. And what they did is they looked at cyberspace, unclassified cyberspace operations over like the last 20 years. And then they conducted a series of regressions to see whether any of those cyberspace operations correlate with the use of violence or other conventional military means. And what they find is almost no evidence that cyberspace operations create escalation out of domain. While there's still an increase of overall cyberspace operations, you're not seeing that that's significantly influencing like crisis outcomes, for example. And what they actually find in their most recent work, which is the Valeriano, Jensen, and Manis, is that the inclusion of cyberspace operations may actually increase the bargaining space for states. And so they see, I don't think it's quite significant, but it's consistent across their various regressions, a decrease in overall violent outcomes when states have cyberspace operations. There's also been an analysis of the use of cyberspace operations within existing campaigns that suggests that cyber operations do not create escalatory effects. So there's some work done by Nadia Kostyuk and her co-author that looked at the Ukraine conflict and regressed the cyber operations that they could find which were generally kind of more focused at the government, but they looked at the cyber operations and looked to see whether there was a significant effect in violent battlefield outcomes. Do cyber operations predicate more violent battles? And they found no correlation there as well. There's also a really good piece from 2012 by John Lindsay where he looks at the effects of Stuxnet. And Stuxnet is the most violent, the most destructive known cyber attack because it created the actual destruction of the Iranian centrifuges. But what Lindsay actually says at the end was that this had very limited overall impact on nuclear development in Iran. So it's a very short-lived effect, even though it was physical. There's also a great piece in both the Journal of Strategic Studies and Security Studies by Erica Borgard and Sean Lonergan that look at the characteristics of creating offensive cyber operations and say that actually it's very difficult to create these offensive cyber operations. And the effects that they create are cascading effects, are very difficult to discern, are covert, and these are therefore not very escalatory. And then finally, a series of war games and experiments, some of which I've been involved with. So I have a piece with Sarah Krebs, recently published in the Journal of Cyber Strategy, where we surveyed the American public and asked them what their support for retaliation would be in a series of different scenarios. And what we varied was whether the scenario was conducted by a cyber attack, a conventional airstrike, or a nuclear attack. And then we kept the means constant. So we had like an economic means, a conventional physical destruction, and then nuclear effects. And what we found was that the American public was significantly less likely to support retaliation when the attack came from cyberspace. And that was even when we held for effects being constant. And we asked our survey takers, do you know that these create the same effects? And they do, right? They consciously understand that the attacks are creating the same effects, but they think they're less escalatory in cyberspace. I also have a series of war games that I've conducted where we find no interaction between cyberspace and escalation. In fact, what we find is that individuals tend to dismiss cyber effects and cyber attacks and are more likely to use conventional means of escalation than cyber means of escalation. And Valeriano and Jensen, in their recent work, find something very similar. So the empirical evidence actually suggests that the DoD is right about this bottom threshold, that the vast majority of cyber attacks can occur without instigating escalation to more violent means of confrontation. So based on that, we do believe that most likely, most cyber operations can be bound here. So we think it's at the lower end of the escalation ladder. But this is really emerging research, and so what we're really uncertain about is the strength of the threshold at the bottom end. And then what there is almost no precedent of are cyber operations with violent, strategic, or overt threat of effects, or cyber operations that are successful against nuclear command and control. And these are operations that the US would consider to be at the higher end of the cyber escalation ladder. And we're really uncertain about where those should go. I will say I'm doing some work on the cyber-nuclear nexus that maybe we can talk about in the future. So here's our threshold problem. The US needs 2 cyber thresholds in order to successfully implement its current strategy. That lower threshold, the defend forward cyber threshold, it has to exist below any level of violence in order to be successful. If US cyber operations create violence, the strategy is, by its own definition, no longer successful. So this would be status quo competition. But at the same time, the United States needs to deter strategic cyber attacks that are occurring at the higher threshold. This is really difficult. And we're seeing a lot of inconsistencies in the US government. You see reports for David Singer in the New York Times that US is trying to put malware in Russian electrical grids. And so there's a hypocrisy, which is difficult for norm diffusion, about the US wanting to conduct operations against critical infrastructure and also trying to deter attacks against its own critical infrastructure. So our recommendation for that is a little bit counterintuitive. The first thing we recommended to the government was, y'all need to know where your cyber thresholds are. So you need to do a better job of defining what the thresholds are. Saying that cyber operations exist under armed conflict is useless because nobody knows what armed conflict really is anymore. So being very clear, at least internally, about what the thresholds are. And our recommendation is that the bottom threshold be a low-level defend forward threshold, which is basically scoped counter cyber operations that create only virtual effects, but are active in the adversaries' networks, even prior to large-scale conflict. But we also advocate a strategic threshold, which are attacks with violent effects on US citizens, infrastructure, and nuclear capabilities that are large-scale or strategic. And we think the US needs to be a norm entrepreneur in order to maintain and create these thresholds. One of the biggest problems I have is the hypocrisy problem. So if you're running amok with defend forward, it's very difficult then to maintain the higher deterrence threshold for strategic cyber attack. And so I've been working on a proposal for a no first use policy for strategic cyber attack, in which the US would have a declaratory policy that it would not conduct the first cyber strategic attack in a crisis. And it would restrain itself and rely on cross-domain punishment if our adversaries were to cross that red line. And I'd love to talk to you guys about whether you think that could possibly be effective. I will tell you that nobody in DoD likes this no first use thing. It's not a big surprise. And then finally, what we found is really effective for both maintaining strategic threshold and the lower end defend forward threshold is for the US government to invest in resiliency measures at the same time that it invests or makes credible cross-domain punishments for strategic cyber attacks. Which these always sound like no-duh recommendations, but resiliency is actually very, very expensive. And so it shows up in every recommendation and generally doesn't show up in the budget proposals. So I'd love now to talk more about these thresholds, about how thresholds have evolved over time, whether they're a useful concept, whether escalation is even linear, and then how the US can try and maintain these two seemingly dissonant thresholds in cyberspace.